It's just about 11 a.m. here. Not here, this is New York City, but in Washington, it's also 11 a.m. And that is where the Supreme Court struck down President Biden's plan to cancel up to $20,000 in student loan debt for millions of Americans. So joining us now is CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson. Let's also bring in Mark Kantrowitz. He's an expert on student loans and an author who has written several books on the subject. CBS News congressional correspondent Nikole Killion is following all of this. And let's also bring in CBS News chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett for reporting from the Supreme Court. So, Jessica, to you, as the lawyer on this panel, what do you make first of this decision by the court to reject President Biden's plan for student loan forgiveness?
This is about what we predicted at the end of very lengthy oral arguments. The court said a couple of things. One, Missouri has the legal standing to sue through a public corporation called MHELA that essentially oversees that state's student loan program. And so the court found that MHELA suffered enough of an injury to allow Missouri to walk into the federal courthouse doors and assert that injury. Now, the second thing the court said is we're looking at this 2003 statute called the HEROES Act, and that's what would give the Secretary of Education the authority to implement this student loan forgiveness program. And the court's looking at two words, waiver and modification. And what the Chief Justice said for five of his colleagues today is that those words, waiver and modification, they don't give the Secretary of Education the power to cancel student loans. And that the last thing the court really said here is, in order for the Secretary of Education to do this, he needs a clearer sign from Congress. He needs express authorization. And that's something called the Major Questions Doctrine that Vlad, you and I have been talking about for over a year now. That's essentially those 3 points are the three big takeaways from today's student loan forgiveness ruling.
And Mark, you've been with us all morning long. Now you've had some time to read in. We're finally giving you some time. So any analysis from you?
So clearly it's a 6-3 decision against the president's student loan forgiveness plan. They found that Missouri has legal standing. They found that the HEROES Act does not authorize a major change. They bring in the Major Questions Doctrine in that regard, saying that Congress would normally reserve this for itself and that Congress has not succeeded in passing legislation for such broad loan forgiveness, and they're trying to make a very clear argument that the existing law supports their decision and that this is not an activist court. And the Major Questions Doctrine has been a fundamental principle for several decades now. It is not something that was created last year in the EPA case. It had existed back in the early 2000s when the court said that Congress doesn't hide elephants in mouse holes.
Nikole, so we know that this plan by the president was pretty much split along partisan lines when it comes to Congress. What are you hearing for those in Congress who are happy with the court's decision and those who are disturbed by it?
Well, as you mentioned, for the most part, reaction thus far has been along those party lines. Keep in mind that this is really a significant victory for Republicans. I mean, yes, there has been this Supreme Court ruling, and people have been waiting for it. But keep in mind, prior to this ruling, Republicans really were trying to halt this program and, in fact, passed legislation to do as much. The president ended up vetoing it, and there weren't enough votes in Congress to sustain a veto override. But this has been a target of Republicans for some time now in terms of doing away with the president's student debt loan forgiveness program. So as you can imagine, people like Speaker Kevin McCarthy have said that, this ruling that the student loan giveaway, in his words, has been ruled unlawful. He goes on to say that the president must follow the law. You have other Republicans saying that they are relieved that this is a victory for hardworking taxpayers because, of course, many Republicans argued, why should debt be forgiven for some individuals when you have other individuals, for instance, who may not have gone to college but who have their own small business, and why should they be responsible for someone's debt, or someone who has repaid their loans? Why should that person be responsible for the debt of others? So that was really Republicans' main sticking point and issue with this program. They also just thought it cost too much, that it wasn't fiscally sound. And so, again, we have seen many attempts within Congress to try to do away with this program. Democrats, on the other hand, especially progressive Democrats who have been advocating and articulating for student debt loan forgiveness, are really upset and floored by this decision. For instance, we have Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who says that this was a disappointing and cruel ruling. He goes on to say that this shows callousness of, in his words, MAGA Republicans, characterizing the court as a MAGA Republican-controlled Supreme Court. So really strong language from the top Democrat in the Senate. You have others like Elizabeth Warren, leading progressive in the Senate, who says that, this fight isn't over, that she believes the president has more tools at his disposal. That is something that we have heard from other progressive lawmakers even before this decision and ruling came down. For instance, Congresswoman Cori Bush out of St. Louis suggested just within the past day that no matter how this ruling shakes out, that she believes that, it's up to the Biden administration to try to continue to make good on their promise to relieve student debt for millions of Americans. So in the view of Democrats, they don't see this fight as being over, even though it's a major setback. Republicans, though, I think feeling very vindicated with this ruling today.
All right, thanks, Nikole. Let's bring in CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett for more analysis. So what are the ramifications, the real-world ramifications for this?
Sure. The Biden administration said up to 37 million Americans would have benefited from this loan forgiveness program. About 16 million or 14 million by the Biden administration's estimates would have had all of their student debt eliminated. So that means there is an economic effect that might have occurred. It's important to point out no one had their debt forgiven. It was blocked almost immediately after the Biden administration announced it. So everyone who took out these student loans or received Pell Grants did so under the assumption that at one level or another that debt would have to be repaid. That's exactly the situation they find themselves in now. The promise, the intent of the Biden administration to provide that debt loan forgiveness no longer exists. What is also true is come October 1st of this year, the forbearance that the Trump administration and the Biden administration provided during COVID expires. What was that forbearance? That you didn't have to make any monthly debt service payments and you would have no penalties assigned for not paying. So for a very long time in the Trump and the Biden administrations, no one has had to repay their student loans at all unless they chose to. That ends on October 1st. And that was going to end on October 1st regardless of this Supreme Court decision. One other thing that this majority's opinion clearly demonstrates: the composition of the court matters. What is a major decision and what falls under that doctrine matters depending on how the court is composed. And all three of the justices, the conservative justices appointed to this court by former President Trump, said in their confirmation hearings that they intended to be sticklers on matters of congressional intent. And if Congress didn't specifically authorize something and an administrative state, meaning an executive branch agency, under any administration, overstep that, they would rule against it. That's exactly what's happened here. They said so in their confirmation hearings. It is being applied in the real world right now.
All right, and Jessica Levinson, let me get your final thoughts here. Some of the politics involved in this. I mean, part of the reason why President Biden, as you know, campaigned on this issue is because, in his words, Congress wasn't acting. It failed to act. At these ballooning student loan debt plans that young people were taking on. So what happens next?
Well, what happens next is that the Biden administration essentially has a choice. They can try to go back to Congress, which obviously they haven't had any luck in the past. And that would have avoided this whole question. If the student loan forgiveness program had been passed as legislation, not an executive act, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. The other thing is that there is another act, the Higher Education Act, and the Secretary of Education could try to do something similar, but under the Higher Education Act as opposed to the HEROES Act. That would require much lengthier rulemaking, and it would undercut the Biden administration's initial argument that they needed to do this because there was an emergency. But as I see it, those are the two tracks, basically another executive order through a different piece of legislation, or trying to go back to Congress, which, again, politically speaking, I think would be extremely difficult.